Sup? As of time of this recording, Pokemon Presents is like 2 days away for July 2025. And as someone who plays a lot of VGC, I wanted to pull out some predictions for champions. More or less like my expectations, my hopes, and my fears, roughly in that order. So let's get into it. Pokemon Champions has been announced as a battle-focused game for the first time since Battle Revolution, really. So, since VGC has been put into a little more spotlight, the expectations are that it will be the VGC game going forward, where it's going to stay that way with future updates, including whatever future generations are going to come up, and also the upcoming Pokemon Legends ZA, which will, for all of its purposes, be a single-player game. So, exactly that's what's kind of to expect. It's going to be a live service style game, so presumably some subscription-based stuff or microtransactions to make money, with future updates, and outside of that, there's like not much else that we can concretely expect. There's lots of things to hope for, though. Primarily, the hope is that, for me, it's going to be a solo viable product in a sense, where ideally you could play just champions and be fine with it, which is, honest to God, my least realistic expectations, since it's going to boil down to buying like all the other games and transferring them over. But the one big thing that I think is the most important one is the free-to-play aspect. If Pokemon Champions is going to be a free-to-play game, then it's got a lot of potential. Because there's one thing that I've been talking about a lot in the recent years, which is the barrier to entry. Because I genuinely think Pokemon VGC runs into this funny little problem that the biggest barrier to entry for competitive Pokemon is knowing it exists. And Champions as a dedicated game for that could very well be the necessary PR that it is. There has been a lot more effort from sides of the official Pokemon channel featuring top players like Aaron Zhang and Wolfie to promote what they're doing, but it is still very much a niche thing where people don't really play Pokemon games for the most part for the multiplayer part. That is a subculture within a subculture. So having something like a Pokemon Champions that is specifically for the purpose of battling and specifically advertises battling against other people like the initial trailer really did, would be a potential goldmine for PR, which is, I think, the biggest weakness that the official circuit has, which is a shame because VGC is kind of awesome at the end of the day. Especially with how the schedule has been announced, we already got our first look into the 2026 season, with the first event starting, as per usual, as early as September, where the release date is kind of an interesting topic. We could say, okay, there's some possibilities maybe just after Worlds, where we can start the circuit right away, with Frankfurt and Monterrey regionals maybe even already being played, which I find a little unrealistic. Considering that we never got even a year for when it's going to come out, when it got initially announced back in February this year. I'd say an interesting spot, if we look through the dates, is October. Not October. December. Because after Stuttgart regionals, there is a 6-week gap between the next regional, especially with 3 regionals being on the same weekend, being January 24th, 25th. So December is an interesting time for this game to come out, because it would mean that we will keep playing Scarlet Violet until the end of the calendar year, and then with the next game coming out, switching to that at the start of calendar year 2026, just like we did back in Sword and Shield, where we played Ultra Series until the end of 2019. And after Sword and Shield's one and only World Championship, we had straight up an off-season until we officially started playing Scarlet Violet in 2023, so I suppose that would make a lot of sense to me. But that's not really any concrete prediction, so there's one very interesting thing, and it leads into the whole free-to-play thing that I brought up, and that is prize money, because I want to talk about something, and that is largest prize pool in esports. And there's this very interesting trend of looking at number 1 to 7 all being the international, or TI, from various years. Now, why do I bring this up when talking about Pokemon? Free-to-play games come, more often than not, with battle passes, and one of the big reasons that the international managed to garner as much of a prize pool as it did, peaking at a whopping $40 million, was in huge part due to how the funding was drawn. Because, and that's a pretty important one, especially looking at the 2021 one, which had this fantastic prize pool, is that a lot of it was contributed through a battle pass. Here's the thing. Don't want to knock on Dota 2. Sure, it's an amazing game for lovely people, but Pokemon? Quite literally the biggest IP on the planet. So this is a model that I always thought would be quite interesting for competitive Pokemon, assuming that we had the free-to-play game, which hopefully Champions is going to be. Funding through a battle pass to lead into a larger prize pool for events like EUIC, NEIC, the World Championship, could lead into some absolutely absurd pricing, because there's some cool stuff that can come with that. Because one of the other factors that bleeds into this is that I think one of the more interesting parts of monetizing a Pokemon game is, at the end of the day, just plain on cosmetics, with the options to customize your own trainer, maybe the Pokeballs in the style of Diamond, Pearl, Platinum it did, or even just having costumes or accessories to equip to the Pokemon themselves to give it a little bit more individuality, would go absolutely crazy. So there is, in my opinion, a lot of potential in Pokemon Champions, just because it can solve the two biggest problems that I've always had with the game, which is, on the one hand, the PR. As I said, I genuinely think the biggest barrier to entry for competitive Pokemon is knowing it exists. And the second thing is, garnering bigger prize pools would definitely be a strength of what is, as I said, the single biggest IP on the planet. So those are my two biggest hopes that make me really, really optimistic for Pokemon Champions, because if you've been following me on things like my Twitch, that's two of the things that I've been talking about quite consistently for the better half of the last decade. So there's a lot in that. But, as I said, I have been burned by this company one too many times to be really, really fully optimistic. So there's certain fears that I have of this. And if I did my job right, you should also see it in a thumbnail. Because one big fear that I have is, at the end of the day, this little thing. Pokemon Showdown has always been an interesting case. Don't use it all that much myself these days, but I think it's a fantastic tool for people interested in competitive Pokemon to get into it. And one of the fears that I genuinely have is that with a battle simulator that's coming officially from the Pokemon Company, they're finally thinking to themselves, hey, so Pokemon Showdown thing that just exists because we let it? Maybe we don't have to do that anymore. Because at the end of the day, the thing that I hope for Champions is that it is basically an officially licensed version of Showdown. But I'm also realistic enough to know that that is never going to happen to that extent. Because you can never quite replicate the ease of use of the team builder with the adjustments being made and having every single Pokemon in every single a constellation available at the press of a couple buttons. Like, I genuinely do not think that that is a realistic hope. And potentially losing that tool scares me. Then there's the whole thing of, well, TPCI being TPCI. There has been some questionable decisions throughout the company's lifespan when it came to how they handled the circuit. Now, don't get me wrong, over the course of like the Scarlet Violet era in particular, they've been doing great work. Bigger prize pools, adjusting the Swiss settings, especially coming into the next season, saying, okay, we're going to do one more round of Swiss to streamline the top cuts, making sure that it basically caps out of the top 16. All good stuff. Also, great choice of the locations. One of the big things it's going to get me back into competing next season is that we're going to have a Prague regional. Good to see them having those events, those kinds of locations again after what I think was 8 years since the last one. But then again, I want to be cautiously optimistic. Because at the end of the day, I think it's borderline impossible to really have all my expectations with. Because as I said, I want it to be a completely solo viable project that is free to play, with monetization being entirely focused around purely cosmetics that do not interfere with the gameplay at all, and having people a borderline showdown-esque team builder available to be able to play whatever they want, whenever they want, because, quite frankly, if you play a team for long enough, you are going to make so many adjustments and test out so many things that inconveniencing the process would be a huge detriment to the quality of life of the player base, which I don't think is a desirable result. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just talking crazy. Maybe I'm just old man ranting. But regardless, I wanted to get my thoughts up before the presents actually happens, because I'm very curious how true it's going to ring to that. Obviously, I'm very curious about what new things ZA is going to bring that are likely going to be implemented in ZA, with primarily Mega Evolutions. Maybe new regional variants. Would love to see some Colosseum Pokemon. But we're going to see that again on Tuesday, where presumably the live reactions are going to be there. But until then, thank you all very much for watching. Have a good one. I'm Casey, and I'm out. Bye-bye.